Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for our virtual talk with Judy Chartrand and Courtney M. Leonard. My name is Sarah Ito, and I'm the Gardiner Museum Curatorial resident this year. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Gardiner Museum operates on the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, the Wendat, and the Treaty Lands of Mississauga of the Credit. The community we work in is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. You may notice that your mics and videos are muted and that the chat option has been disabled. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be made available later at a later date. So today's program is presented as part of the Gardiner Museum's International Ceramic Arts Fair, which started last week and will be ending on the 18th of June. We are excited to have Judy Chartrand and Courtney M. Leonard joining us to speak about their works and their process. Their works, represented by Fair and Contemporary, is currently on view at the museum. We really encourage you to visit ICAF if you have not already done so. We would also like to welcome Leslie Farron, who will join us later to share a few remarks from Fair and Contemporary. So the way we're going to have this program be led today is that we will be starting with presentations by both Judy and Courtney in regards to their work. And then we'll move into a conversation to unpack Judy and Courtney's processes. And then we will end with a Q&A. And we invite you to send in your questions through the Q&A function at any point. So I'm going to start with introducing Judy Chartrand. So Judy is a Manitoba Cree who grew up in a marginalized neighborhood in Vancouver. She gained an interest in ceramics in the late 1980s, starting with painting, ready-made ceramics, and eventually hand building her own creations. She uses her practice to share personal encounters with racism, as well as to bring visibility to the experiences faced by many others on a daily basis. She adeptly layers ready-made appropriations and found objects with humor and/or satire. Courtney M. Leonard is an artist and filmmaker of the Shinnecock Nation on Eastern Long Island. Her work explores marine biology, Indigenous food sovereignty, migration, and human environmental impact. Leonard's current project articulates the multiple definitions of the term breach and investigate and document Indigenous communities' historical ties to water, marine life, and Native cultures of subsistence. So now I'm going to welcome Judy to share about her work. So Judy, if you would like to unmute and start your video and your presentation, please do so. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was ready to start.
You're
good. Okay. All right, so go ahead and start. All right. Hello.
Yes,
everyone.
please do.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and the Gardiner, for hosting this talk. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in Vancouver, BC. I'm honored to be here, and I'm happy to be sharing this program spot with Courtney M. Leonard. Although we've never met in person, we have connected a few times over the past couple of decades. I highly admire the stance she takes, and I'm proud of her and her voice. I also want to thank Leslie of Fair and Contemporary and Sequoia Miller for the invite to participate in the 2023 International Ceramic Art Fair at the Gardiner. I've been working with clay for about 34 years. I've also worked with mixed media, and more recently, say in the past 6 years, I've been treading in the public art realm, and that's been a very learning experience. Last year, I was invited to submit work for a group exhibition titled Our America, Whose America at the Fair and Contemporary. I submitted one plate and was invited to submit more. For this presentation, I'll be including visuals to show some of the steps I take when making work. Oops, how do I do the next slide? There we go. Sorry. Okay, titled The Great Spirit Smiles. I took two leading images showing natives watching the arrival of Spanish ships. I thought I'd flip the script by reworking them to show the departure of the Americas with the ship towing barges full of all of the toxicity whites have brought or created while here. In addition to this, I've researched to find out whose territory was located in Massachusetts, where Fair and Contemporary is located. And I wanted to honor that by including the Wampanoag language on the plate. I translated it in English for the title. The Great Spirit Smiles expresses this departure as one of celebration and no doubt great relief. The Wampanoag miraculously survived the era of extermination by the European colonizers, and sadly, their language didn't, as I learned that there are no living fluent speakers. Here in Canada, there is support given for initiatives by Indigenous communities and organizations to reclaim, revitalize, maintain, and strengthen Indigenous languages. I know that the Wampanoag are currently working hard towards revitalizing, and they currently have over 100 speakers of varying fluency. This next image is a plate that was also included in our America, Whose America group exhibition. Again, as part of my culling of materials, I found a 1758 painting depicting a portrait of Jeffrey Amherst, who was viewed as a highly decorated military man. He was a commander-in-chief of the British forces in America, as well as the governor of Quebec, a crown governor of Virginia, and was also given the title Lord. In addition to this, there have been multiple sites located in Canada and the United States named in his honor. My way of honoring him was to include a nameplate with the text J. Amherst, y'all's hero, and I titled the plate Is a Zero. I thought it was fitting after learning that he advocated the use of biological warfare through smallpox-infected blankets to kill Indigenous peoples. In one of his letters, he wrote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, and as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." Extirpate means to root out and destroy completely. Execrable means wretched, atrocious, inferior, and vile, just to name a few. I superimposed his portrait over another image that is included in the 16th century Florentine Codex, that is a collection of materials and information pertaining to the Aztec and the Nahua history. The image is an Indigenous drawing documenting smallpox infection in the Nahua of that time. When I was invited to participate in the International Ceramic Art Fair at the Gardiner, I decided to focus on creating mini dioramas and revived a work that I had originally made in 2007 titled White Fantasies. It focuses on representations of white women portrayed as the ideal of beauty and how that representation embeds itself into the minds of Indian men who have been psychologically influenced by the predominance of imagery as seen in movies and advertising. A greater part of this mindset stems from racism, class prejudice, and feelings of self-worthlessness. I have decorated his room with pinup posters featuring Farrah Fawcett, Bo Derek, and others. I've also included a mix of movie promotional posters with titles The Weird Lovemakers, The Pleasure Machines, along with a number of Red Power and American Indian Movement posters, a stereotypical Indian prayer, and a few of my own photos. The single bed signifies the loneliness he must feel in not being able to obtain what he so much desires. The figure originally started out as a rubber squeak toy that I had cast to get the likeness of the face. I hand-built the body into a reclining position and added a box of tissues at the foot of the bed. The overall effect works to reveal the absurdity of men of color who engage in having white fantasies. This next work is entitled Redbone Bert and is a humorous First Nations version of the 1972 Cosmopolitan magazine Centerfold, featuring a reclining nude Burt Reynolds. My Bert is modestly wearing a breechcloth while reclining on a bearskin rug that holds an ashtray with a partially burnt braid of sweetgrass from my reserve, the Pine Creek Nation in Manitoba. I've also included a sound recording of the song Come and Get Your Love by the 70s rock band Redbone, whose members were of Mexican American and Native American heritage. I am promoting Redbone Bert as a visual treat for all First Nations aunties. The final diorama is entitled The Sacred Gift. I wanted to include something that focused on the importance of water, not only to all living beings, but also for the Indigenous relationship we have with it as our lifeblood and as medicine. I had blue transparent plexiglass laser cut to simulate rolling waves. And as an afterthought, I added the seal in the background because the swimming scene reminded me of an incident my daughter Janine had when she was a preteen. We had gone to the beach and she was swimming quite a ways out in the ocean. She said she heard a sound, so she stopped and turned only to find herself face to face with a seal. I asked her how she reacted, and she told me that she just looked back at it, then continued on swimming. With that said, this concludes my presentation. Thank you for spending your time with me. Miigwech. Oops, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Judy. Now I would like to welcome Courtney to begin sharing your presentation.
Tabutni, thank you for having me. I'm joining you from Haudenosaunee territory. I am close to the Everson Museum, where my husband has a opening of his work. His name's Frank Buffalo Hyde. So I just want to acknowledge him, his family, and his territory. I'm Shinnecock from Long Island, New York, and I wanted to introduce you this evening to my more recent body of work in relationship to the context of breach and the logbooks that I call my visual account of what I see above and below the horizon line of life and what I'm witnessing from the shore. As Shinnecock people, we're water people. In English, it translates to people of the level land or people of the shore. And the Shinnecock Bay is our estuary and our ecological place that feeds us. The work that is on view as a part of the International Ceramic Art Fair at the Gardiner Museum is inclusive of the work of breach. It incorporates a basket, a burden. I call it my burden study. It's kind of crossover looking anthropological terms that were imposed on Indigenous people in terms of burden baskets that are labeled along the California and Northwest coastal territories. They're baskets that were used for gathering were often termed the word burden. I sometimes question the use of this imposed English language on things that would not be a burden. So if you fill your basket with food or you fill your basket with firewood to burn in your home, you're doing it in a loving and caring way for your community, and it is therefore not a burden. So therefore that series, the conical shapes of the baskets are relating to fish baskets. They're relating to amplification of the issues we're facing in regards to climate change, and they're also countering the word burden. The other works that are in the exhibition incorporate an overlay between shipping containers being rectangular forms, as well as box track forms that are a part of our subsistence harvesting ecology currently today on our marine docks and off the bays for harvesting lobster, crab, oysters, in terms of bushel bags, and a few other things that I observe. I often weave these into installations. I'm trying to invite the audience into my memory of place, and I am mapping the space so that the audience becomes a navigator through those areas, and they're able to navigate and witness some of the layers that I am witnessing as a Shinnecock person today. This work is called Breach Logbook 22. The number 22 or 23 that is at the end of the logbooks is an account of the year that I'm currently in. So for instance, this year I'm working on Breach Logbook 23, and then there usually is a singular word after the logbook that defines the vignettes or scenes that I'm viewing, and it also questions some of the issues. So for this iteration of Breach, it is called Cull. I was looking at the culling of our local foods taken to the restaurant, which would be our oysters. Sometimes, depending on what's happening in the environment, we may have a period of time where we are not allowed to harvest or can't harvest our shellfish to eat because of some of the toxins that they're filtering. This year also, this work was honoring or looking at the fact that Shinnecock Bay, which is close to our reservation on the east end of Long Island, has been deemed a marine ecological hope spot through Dr. Sylvia Earle's work for Mission Hope. And I, upon observing that, was a little bit concerned that the work of ecological work sometimes continues to erase the Indigenous people of those areas in terms of their contributions and histories to caring for ecology and our waters. So this Breach Logbook 22 Cull is an exploration of those intercultural relationships, reliances, and impacts. As I am often thinking about past, present, and future and pulling them into installations or vignette studies of what I'm observing, I do a lot of research, which is the invisible, unseen work. I often visit locations and sites. I work with local place to understand what that particular logbook should speak to. And in this situation, it was really loving and personal to go home to do this installation for Shinnecock Bay at the Stony Brook University campus. So my daughter, we were harvesting some of the local shell heaps that are used for coastal erosion projects. And then we had to take them back home to our reservation to clean them for the installation. So I just wanted to show you some of the unseen labor that also has a connection to place and materiality and environment. And that's my daughter helping to wash those shells. Some of the things that I hope to offer to the audience or those that support the work of Breach and are learning through the question that I pose, which is, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions that culture, is to really think about our global personal responsibility to sustainability and impact. Often Indigenous people are placed with a huge amount of responsibility to fix the things that we did not collectively contribute to in regards to environmental impact and climate change. So this image is showing kind of the a work or an installation I had done at Pomona College called Intermodal, and I pair it with a image of our import and export of shipping. You can see the mass volume of shipping containers that are on top of this vessel. And I had thought about the word intermodal because one of the shipping containers has the name intermodal on it. And that was overlaid with the burden studies that I had created for that installation called Intermodal Breach Logbook 2019 at that time. More recently, literally 2 weeks ago, I had just delivered a piece that I had created over the past year called Contact 2023. It maps out home, my territory of Long Island, Our nation, in terms of the shape of Long Island, it's often referred to as an abstract whale, and culturally we view it as such. So on the fork or tail of the whale, we are on the lower fork at the beginning of the tail of the whale in terms of our traditional territories. But in regards to water, we would go everywhere. And this piece is mapping out Long Island on a 4-foot by 8-foot canvas with over 2,600 of my thumbprints in contact with the land in terms of the material of clay or porcelain, mapping out territory and place. And it also speaks to the history of what are referred to as treaty belts, which were a nation-to-nation agreement through a document of a belt that was woven with wampum, which comes from the quahog shell, and that particular shell forms purple and white that only comes from coastal territories. So sometimes when people are speaking to the history of treaty belts, they may not often ask where the shell comes from. And I try to think about that because Shinnecock and Shinnecock Bay, we have historically been some of the largest producers of wampum. And it is because of the ecology and beauty of our place. But because of climate change, warming waters, we have sometimes what's referred to as brittle shell disease. And that made me think about, well, what is going to happen if at a certain point the shells are not strong enough for us to work with? So my alternative sometimes in the studio is working with clay. And then this piece, each of the porcelain thumbprints act as kind of my mark, my maker's mark within my place as being a Shinnecock person generationally. And it also includes some portraits or pictures of my family members and things that I've witnessed. So this is a portrait of my great grandmother, Blanche-Elise Carl, and it's overlaid with some of the history of blue and white and the Dutch colonists and their impact coming to our territory. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see the quahog shell of the purple and white, and then my iteration of the thumbprint, and then the artificial sinew that is now on view at the Heckscher Museum of Art and a part of their permanent collection. I also more recently completed my first public art installation, and I wanted to share this piece. In the upper right-hand corner is Henry Thompson, and he was someone who kept for the longer time traditional root cellars on our reservation, and him and his children. But for a while, that practice of using root cellars and the natural land to store food has not been something that everyone continues to practice. It was actually an imposition of law put on our community by the town of Southampton. They placed laws around the 1600s, 1700s that we weren't allowed to keep our root cellars because when they brought cattle to Long Island, their cattle would fall into the root cellars, and we were obligated to either pay back the cow due to its broken leg, and if we couldn't pay back the cow, they would take land in kind. So when I had the opportunity to do a public artwork at a location called Planting Fields in Oyster Bay, which has a history of cultivation and plants through the Coe family. And the Coe family were also insurance brokers for shipping insurance. I wanted to do this piece called Breech Logbook 23 Root, looking at the root cause of imposition and the shift of our food relationships. That ties to the whale, which I often use as a metaphor in Breech, because the majority of whales killed per year are struck by our shipping industry. So that boat that I had shown, and then some of the rectangular forms that are on view at the Gardiner Museum are this cross between containment, shipping, import, export, and subsistence. So for the root cellar, we buried a shipping container, and you enter it through the jaws of a northern right whale on either side. You can also cross over the top of the root cellar and in a way visually fall into the oval pod shape that is supposed to speak to that top view of a whale as they go by Long Island. Let's see. The interior includes traditional cooking vessels from our territory, but they're not completely traditional because I've crossed them over with a series of work that I called artifice, that is involving these holes within concrete orbs that are used for coastal restoration projects. So I wanted to cross this idea of not being able to store food, not being able to use the functionality of the root cellar with our traditional food pots that I had fired in a soda firing. So you can see some of that loading of the soda kiln in the lower right-hand side. Hung inside the root cellar is a cowhide that has some metallic blue kind of star relationships to it. And then there are pods of oyster shells within there. I installed this week, and I think all of us have experienced the smoke that's traveling from Canada through the world. And there was a period of time where I wasn't able to install outside because I couldn't breathe. So I often think about what we see and what we don't see. And at least for the past couple of weeks or month, our territories have seen and have breathed the impact of climate change. And I hope that that gives people pause and ignites them to think about how we can better care for our place and our relationship to locality. I often try to finish off with a couple components of joy, because some of the work of Breach can be layered with intense relations and truth. But my biggest joy is that, you know, why am I doing this and why am I speaking to it? It's to think about what we're leaving behind for our next generations. My daughter's 12 and her biggest joy is being in the water. And so I hope for that continuity and care. In that regard, I also want to thank Judy Chartrand for being here today and for her work, because I embarked as a ceramic artist on my journey through education a while ago, and I often didn't find a lot of people who were Indigenous and contemporary artists working in the medium. And somehow Judy and I found one another when I was in grad school, and we've reached out to each other on occasion. And I just think that that kind of mentee-peer relationship is something that is just really a caring act. And I just am really honored to be here today speaking with Judy. And the other thing that I love about that connection is that Judy's work embarks on components of Indian humor. And sometimes the laughter is the other part that we need to heal one another. So thank you for this time together.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing more about your works and your practice. It was really enriching to just sit and listen after spending some time with your work at ICAF this week. So I'm gonna invite both of you to, Judy, to turn on your camera as I ask a few more questions to unpack a bit of your work a bit more before we go into Q&A. So for those who are attending, please take this time to maybe think about what you're curious about or what you would like to know more about, and use the Q&A function to submit a question. But in the meantime, I will start. So I love, Courtney, that you ended on the note that you found Judy through her ceramics practice, and it wasn't common for you to see another Indigenous artist working with the material of clay. And so this question is to both of you, but what compels you to work with the medium of clay to explore these particular questions? So for Judy, to kind of explore these sociopolitical issues of racism, economic injustice, and then for you, Courtney, why clay to explore kind of questions of water and marine life and sustainability? Yeah, what compels you to the medium? So Judy, if you could go first, and then maybe we can give to Courtney.
Well, I work, I think any medium I work in is going to be focusing on social political issues. life has been really difficult for so many First Nations people that, it's hard to be complacent. I know dealing with issues such as white racism is not the most comfortable position to be in, not only for viewers, but also for myself. I do so as a necessity, though, to make people realize that we're all the same. No one is better and no one is less than. That's it. Did I answer?
Yeah. Courtney, would you like to share why you feel compelled to work with clay to explore your questions?
Let's see. I always talk about kind of the malleability of touch in my initial connection. I did work with Play-Doh when I was younger, and I just would create things. I actually created my food for playing house or in the kitchen or something like that. And then I had access to clay when I was in high school through a strong arts program. And then my continuity with clay is just understanding that this is so it has a life and connection to it that I often feel that I'm in a back and forth relationship of conversation. So I'm always learning with clay. Now, how clay relates within the concept of breach is that I often question when people hold to labels without asking themselves what is their part in that construct. So what I mean is sometimes people have asked or referred to me as an environmental artist, and I question that terminology because I feel that if I were to hold on to that label or language, which probably comes with the imposition of being someone who is an artist and happens to be Indigenous and works in the art world, we're often asked to give a lot more contextually and a lot more in terms of what are we doing, what is it called, how does it relate to the past, those types of things. So when I think about what it means to work with clay in relationship to environmental work, unless you are digging or harvesting your own clay locally, then you're a part of an extractive system. So I started to think about what is that extractive system, and also what is the accessibility that I have when laws are infringed on our community that we can't access, for instance, whale bones or materials of subsistence that we had harvested as a traditional practice. Well, what I have access to is clay, and I'm able to kind of fashion and work with the material in a way that speaks to the memory of place. And then if that clay is coming from the land and coming from the earth, then what is that kind of overlay with environmental fragility and extraction when I'm talking about extraction? So I do like to play with the concept of fragility with using ceramics and weaving it, because if people take more care to hold a basket, then maybe they'll take more care to hold the land and their place with the land. So there's a lot of different things. The other thing is I think psychologically I wouldn't be a good person if I wasn't in the studio working with clay. So I find clay to be kind of like a healing component to my life. It just helps me to be who I am. But yeah, those are just a couple of points. Not as clear and concise and poignant as Judy. So I have to practice writing them down more. It's good.
No, thank you. That's really generative to think about, especially with like the imagery of some of the latest work with seeing the imprints of your fingerprint into clay all together, and like tying it back to how you paid attention to like sensations of touch from a young age of playing with like Play-Doh and how that has transformed. So I have so my next question for Judy, I would love if you could share more about the research process that you embark on in creating these like ceramic scenes. So when learning a little bit more about your practice, I know that you incorporate a lot of like research materials such as like archival photos, found objects, and they serve as like an entry point into your creative process. So yeah, if you could share more about what your research looks like when you, and how it gets to the kind of final like scenes that you create?
It's very simple. For many of my ideas, my go-to place as a starting point is usually eBay. I find it's a place that you can find the most random amount of things, either to look at or to try to purchase for use. After that, it's Google, and I spend days and days researching and searching until I'm able to finally formulate an idea that eventually becomes something tangible. I have quite a big collection of vintage photographs, and I used to have a fairly big library as well. I kind of gave all that up except for my my collection of photos, and racist memorabilia is another thing that I also have a small collection of. I think social media as well, there's so much happening, like through videos of all sorts of terrible things, that you have to find a way to process that as well. So, if something really hits me hard and I need to process it, then that's what I do. I mean, I did a piece on Michael Brown's shooting, and that was also in a really quite a big, large diorama piece. And the title of that ended up being, I think I had like, "Whose Child Are You?" was a quote by Baldwin, and basically had it as he's our little boy. And the background of that diorama was text that I culled from YouTube videos people were just throwing a lot of hatred, a lot of spewing, a lot of hatred about about him, because they were making the assumption that he had like this real criminal activity, and he was killed for really no reason at all except for maybe a cigarette. So that's how I get my I guess my ideas.
Yeah, and I guess like with the I'm curious, like, because you said some of the like objects kind of also hold like a lot of significance in your research process. Is it are there particular places that you look to for such objects, or are you open to kind of receiving that anywhere? Like, yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense more of that.
I think just really anywhere, and if I can't find it, then I make it. So, I mean, that's the one thing about clay is it's very, it's very plastic, and it's just well, hard to say. Sorry.
Mhm. No, it can be so big, and there's so many metaphors to think about clay with too. Yeah, thank you for sharing more about that. Courtney, I would love, when I was reading about you, I was learning that the offshore art movement has played a role, or has impacted your artistry and your practice, and I would love if you could like share more about what that movement is, and its your like relationship to your work, if at all.
Yes, so in the history of my practice with Breach, I have a body of work called Breach Number 2, which is a shipping palette with about 60 ceramic sperm whale teeth on top of that palette. And it speaks to kind of the imposition of laws infringed on Indigenous communities that use materials from the whale or walrus or any animal that would be under the laws of ivory, which tend to be international laws that infringe on certain communities to either harvest and or use material culturally or for economic survivance. So when I had created that piece, it was in an exhibition called Radical Seafaring at the Parish Art Museum on Long Island, and the curator at the time Oh, Andrea Grover. I was like, oh my gosh, don't forget her name. She had coined the term offshore art movement as a way that the artists that were invited for that exhibition are artists whose practice is not solely in the studio, but with the shore and on the water. So for my pursuit and journey of the work of Breach, I started as, I'm one person from my nation, and I'm, I'm seeing certain things, but I don't speak for my entire community. So I want to acknowledge that, nor do I speak for any other Indigenous communities. I'm just talking about what I see. And so when I was thinking about, okay, well, our waters are rising when we have a hurricane like category 6 or above, pretty much 3/4 of our reservation is going to be covered over. We are having water quality issues where we can't eat our shellfish at certain seasons. And when I grew up, I never remembered that being an issue. People didn't get sick eating locally. So I started to form that question, can a culture sustain itself, as an understanding for myself, like, what am I doing with this work? Because when I first started Breach and I was asked to give a title for a show, I called it Breach. And then I remember talking to my husband, who's also an artist, that I'm being asked to give a title to this next show, and I still feel that it's Breach. Can I call the show the same thing? And he said, you're the artist, you can do whatever you want. And I said, okay, yeah, that's true. But how do I explain it to the curators and the art historians that may be expecting a certain thing from me? And so how I was able to counter what it is that I'm doing is that Breach is that imposition. It's the whale as it's breaching through the surface. It's a breach of contract. It holds so many different ways of entry points. And then how I can have Breach continue is that, well, what is it that I'm doing? I'm seeing what's happening. So those logbooks come from the history of my ancestors on tall ships for the whaling industry, and they would keep logbooks or accounts. And I'm, as a contemporary person, like keeping a visual account. So they become the logbooks. But my biggest intention that goes to the question of the offshore art movement is that as I'm a Shinnecock person, if I'm in this situation, if we as a nation are in this situation as Shinnecock people, and when people want to talk about water issues and indigeneity, they often go to certain communities, but they don't realize that they've then traveled 2,000 miles from Long Island, where in support of water issues, they could also support locally. And so sometimes certain Indigenous people are not heard. They're not given voice. They're not brought to the table. And I started to realize that it would be important for me to travel to other communities and ask them what's happening. Or, is it the same thing? Is it different things? So I've traveled offshore to different territories that my ancestors had traveled to. So Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq territory with artists up there, Alan Syliboy, Franny Francis, Charles Doucette. I've been up to Utqiagvik, North Slope region in Alaska, been to Aotearoa. I have people I consider my family that are part of Breach. So all in all, that's the best way I can answer my definition of the offshore art movement. It's just basically being native. It's just like you just go and you build community and you build relationships and you build understanding. And then it's also important for myself to try to go back and to give back as much as I can. So that's how I would define the offshore art movement. It's like, how do you build community? How do you build place? And how do you observe what's happening? So to observe what's happening, you have to go out sometimes. So.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up because I was really interested when you're talking about, you said that Breach relates to all of your work, like that anchoring word and all that it means. But I was wondering, how has the term Breach kind of shifted for you over the years? Like, as you were saying in one show, you were working with the term Breach and you wanted to call it that, and then for another show you wanted to continue that. I guess over time, how has that word shifted for you in your work, or maybe expanded?
It's allowed me freedom. I think artists sometimes are not given the freedom to create. We may give that impression that we are, but sometimes at a certain point in your career, you can be asked to make the same thing over and over again. And for myself as an individual, I was worried about that. I wanted to be my whole self. I wanted to respond to what I'm seeing. And this was a way for me to hold space with that in a loving and intentional way. So Breach, let's see, the first Breach logbook was 2014, and I'm in 2023, so it's been about 10 years of observations. And within each logbook, it just depends on what's happening around us. So sometimes the work has embarked on a series called Abundance, for instance, which I'm looking at mass fish dies, and I'm weaving these fish baskets to think about what does it mean to fill your basket with fish. But how can you fill your basket if they're dying, or they're not healthy to eat, or they might contribute high mercury levels to your blood systems? Then I have also done, for instance, the word call, thinking about how it is that we as Indigenous people, like as soon as we want to do any economic development enterprise, we are bombarded with how we can't do that. Like, don't have a casino, don't do this, don't do that. But when you look at how people extract from our territory for restaurants and fishing industries and all of that, they are calling our economic possibilities. And the same thing is kind of happening with environmental contracts. There are other entities that are getting large amounts of environmental funding, while our Shinnecock Environmental Department is also applying to the same constructs. So that could be another overlay of call. Let's see, another iteration is the subsistence series. So we have the box trap forms. That I'm learning a lot as I go, and I am out offshore. So I've followed baymen, and I've started to think about the overlay between not just Indigenous conversations, but these are just water conversations. And if you're a bay person and you're harvesting to feed your family, it's a hard life. So you're not even getting paid enough. The restaurant owners and the investors are getting paid the most. So I'm learning myself as I'm on this journey. And I think the best thing that I can do to simplify all the layers I'm talking about is just offer one word. And in that word, there's a lot of different definitions that people can navigate themselves. And then sometimes people will send me emails and they'll ask, like, is this what you saw? Because this is what I'm seeing. And then sometimes I learn too, like I did a series that was a part of an installation called Nebulous. And it was just looking at how, aside from the shipping industry, the whales are being entangled in the box trap form. So a lot of people have conversations about that within their art. I'm just kind of looking at that overlay of fragility between what I can weave with the clay and how I can kind of cast those shadows and depth and overlay in the installation. So I really love documenting memory through intimate parts of, like, I take photos everywhere. And then how I translate those photos is I really zoom in, and then I bring that forth in the glazes and the surface. And so a lot of it is just kind of like poetic layered memory of place. And I try to abstract it because, sometimes people don't listen to us, like as Native people. They don't think that what we're saying applies to them. They don't think that the racism is something that they are contributing to daily. So sometimes, at least in my practice, I've abstracted that all of this is that. But I'm trying to see if I can get people to stay a little longer, because often they would walk in, or they would see the title Native Show or something, and they wouldn't even show up for the conversation. So I just don't, I've had to kind of combat the nuances of surviving in art. Like, I don't know, like it's just, or life or education or outreach, or yeah. And I hope that some of it is so that, if our waters are rising, Shinnecock people aren't going to fix that. That's on other people to start to decrease their impact on what they're contributing to. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I do think, yeah, like your work, both of your work really does feel like an invitation to me to like really sit with what you're asking, what you're bringing up, what you're reflecting. And yeah, I hope that in the art world you can exercise as much freedom and refusal as you can. So I'm gonna go to the Q&A. We have 2 questions from Heidi McKenzie. Hi, Heidi. Judy, so this is for Judy, this is a technical question from another ceramic artist.
Okay.
So Heidi's asking why paper clay on this in the plates specifically. So why are you using paper clay in the plates?
I've always just used paper clay because it's a low-fired white clay. I don't have any other thing to add to that. I used to use a low fire, just your regular, white clay. And I was finding that some of the underglaze was starting to pop off of it. So I ended up just switching to the paper clay, and it's been working, but I'm finding even now, like I'm having a little bit of problems with it because I guess clay bodies are starting to change. I did try one that was I think without talc, and I couldn't even work with it. So I went back to the paper clay.
Thank you. Okay, so the second question is also from Heidi for Courtney this time. So Heidi says, I was struck by the visual reference of some of your work at the Gardiner to the 2D large scale paintings of the late Caribbean Canadian artist Denise Tomasos. So the reference to cages as a global trope for entrapment of peoples. I'm wondering if you thought about cages not only as they reference the marine world, but also to peoples, and if that is an extension of your meaning making. That's quite a long question. So if you wanted to reread it.
Well, that's okay. I will say that I never talk about things that I don't know. So I'm not familiar with that artist's work. And and I can only speak to what came to those particular forms, is that alongside me questioning the term burden that was placed on the baskets, I also question the word trap. So trap is not a part of the way that I was raised or taught to fish. If you lay out your line or you lay out a certain way, you never block the passage of the fish to migrate or to breed. So anything that comes into that space is understood as like meant for you, offered to you. So you're not completely trapping. How I navigate that kind of language questioning with some of the work is that in the past, when I would create the box trap forms or the just the kind of abundance weaving forms, I would leave openings in some of those designs so that the viewer could visually pass through a hole and they could continue on visually. But then when I was thinking about the entanglement of those traps that peak, sometimes in the bays, if they're left behind, the ghost traps, then I started to think, well, you know what, there are times where you are completely trapped, and I didn't leave any openings in those design forms. I think one of the parallel trap studies is on view at ICAF, and that doesn't have an opening, but the burden study basket does kind of have an opening. And that opening was also that when I had viewed the collection at Pomona College, which is something sometimes I struggle with the history of what is asked of Native artists sometimes. It's like when I grew up, they would have a show of your work if they could pair it to something historical. So they would say, oh, well, we would have you in the show because we have some of your community's cultural items, and therefore we are giving you more authenticity to be seen because we can pair your authenticness with that past. That is difficult if you're a coastal person who wasn't a part of that collective impositional colonial history of extraction from Indigenous communities, because most of your stuff rots. You're by the ocean, so it's meant to decay. So the only thing that we have that tend to be in collections are ceramic shards, which was a part of my graduate studies. And then also scrub brushes and some of the kind of weaving of caning on the back of chairs and stuff. So the only time that I ever viewed the actual cage was when I was in the North Slope Borough, and I was staying at the Marine Borough Center, where they sometimes will tag wildlife like polar bears or wolves or things like that. And what I love about traveling is light. Light changes wherever you are. And in the North Slope in Alaska, it was the first time I really saw sundogs on the right and left of the sun up there. And I remember that sun peeking through the polar bear cages where they tagged. And that was some overlay that I do have memory of that kind of crosses into those subsistence boxtrap forms. But I didn't relay it to that work. I don't have an understanding of it, or I don't know it. So those were what I was seeing and what I was responding to.
Thank you. So I just want to be mindful of time because we are just about at 5 p.m. There seems to be a few more questions. One more question. Do we have time for an extra one, or I don't know, I'm not sure if I should ask it. Okay, one more question. Okay, so this question is anonymous. It comes from an anonymous attendee. Thank you both for sharing insights behind the creation for your work. For Courtney, could you explain the glazing process for the breach logbook 23? Subsistence boxes presented at ICAF. And for Judy, the box diorama is displayed at ICAF open an opportunity for a larger series. Are there other themes you're considering depicting in this style of display? Judy, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, it's what I'm doing right now is I'm working on more boxes in different settings, different size boxes as well. I think there's going to be an art fair in Miami in December that one of the galleries down here is going to be taking the work to and sort of building a booth around it. I was doing the dioramas back in 2007. I think I only did 2 of them. One was found objects, one was white fantasies, and I found that they took a lot of time, like you had to really think about how you're going to all, fit everything all together in order to make some kind of a statement. And I kind of parked them for all these years until this opportunity came up, and I've decided to bring them back out again to see if I could actually do it. I've only got like a tiny little mold of the face, and so I end up right now, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of casting a lot of face. They look like little baseballs. And as I'm making something, I'll fit it all to that. It's but I'm keeping the same, like the original rubber squeak toy was sort of like, had like that pink colored skin and the blue pants and the black shoes and the red feathers. So I'm keeping, for the most part, all of that to be continued on with the series. And that's pretty much it.
That's
Yeah,
really
I-
exciting. I'm very much looking forward to seeing. Courtney, did you just want to take like maybe like a minute to answer the question about glazing?
Yeah, I was just thinking sometimes I hear artists talk and they're like magic. And but that's honestly I don't have enough time to talk about my process. But I will say that I often make my own glazes, so I kind of have a better understanding of if the prices of that extraction system is making those materials go up or down. And sometimes some of the glazes incorporate sand. Sometimes I have a long history of down firing as a part of my practice. So I start high and I go down low and I just layer, layer, layer. So a good majority of the pieces are what people, if they're familiar with like tricolor, there's probably tricolor times 4 on the surface of what I'm doing to kind of evoke the crust and the organic naturalism of decay that happens on traps or inland or in place. So yeah, I think I just don't think I have enough time to go in the details. And then I fire in the round. And I think that's also a history too. I shared the pot from our community and it's in the shape of a seed. And we never had flat bottoms in our vessels until colonists came. So when I think about my overlay between what would be considered like cultural traditional forms to like what someone would view as an abstract box trap form, I'm practicing the same things. I fire in the round. There's no grounding to the work. They can be positioned in any way. They're hung on the wall. They're on the floor. Those are some of kind of the practice overlays. And then I did want to just really say thank you again to the Gardiner Museum, to Fair and Contemporary, and to Judy, because I just really love Judy's work because I understand it, relate to it, and it brings me joy. And it also is components of like of intimacy and installation and American like like it's American with air quotes like kind of scenery of, when we look at what is imposed of us in landscape American paintings in places, then you look at what is historically a diorama that has generational access of understanding of education and place, and then amplifying that with pop culture and humor. And it really speaks, I imagine, beyond myself to a lot of Indigenous people and understanding relation and experience. So I'm just really honored to be here speaking with you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. I'm going to quickly ask Leslie from Fair and Contemporary to unmute and turn your camera to share some remarks. Hi.
Hi, this has been so informative. Thank you to the Gardiner Museum and Sarah and Sama for organizing and inviting and coming up with this format so that so many people from far away can learn more about Judy and Courtney's work and learn more about the fair that has been growing steadily since Sequoia first called me. And I learned a lot today, which is kind of the whole reason that I love my job. And I love working with artists, particularly artists who are have something to tell me that I haven't learned before, and their work does that, and their practice does that. So I hope that conveys to the audience that's coming to the fair and the people who will hear this later, that the opportunity to see this and see the comparisons in the source material and hear the dialogue between Courtney and Judy is just so fabulous. So really just a lot of thank you. And if anyone is in Western Massachusetts this summer, we're on the Mass MoCA campus right on the border of Vermont and New York. and we'll be showing work again this summer in an exhibition that asks a really great question. Are we there yet? So the artists whose work will be there are going to be, saying where are we? How did we get here? And where are we going? So I look forward to more dialogue and more opportunities to learn from these two fabulous artists. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Leslie. Yes, I just want to extend a huge thank you and gratitude to Leslie, Courtney, Judy. Learning and thinking more deeply with your work, especially after seeing in person, has been so enriching. So truly thank you for being here and sharing more about your work. And thank you to those who have attended and asked questions. Thank you to the Gardiner team, Sama and Richard, for tech support. Yeah, this has been a lovely way to spend a Friday afternoon. So I hope everyone has a beautiful and safe weekend. Yeah.
Thank you.